Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's lecture by Dr. Peter Howarth. Peter's going to be talking to us tonight about the relationship between Leeds and Mongolia. Now, Peter needs little introduction. He is our honorary secretary and does a good job for us as secretary. And his last post, he worked at Leeds University. He's now retired, but he was Deputy Director of the Language Centre at the university. So I'll hand over to you now, Peter.
Thanks, Chris. Well, welcome, and thank you very much for coming to what might appear to most people a rather obscure topic. Not to everybody, but this could be subtitled "Not Many People Know," which I think is true. I keep being asked, what is this collection? No one's ever heard of it. But it's genuine, it's true. A few years ago, Janet Douglas organised some talks about Leeds migration. Caribbean, Italian, Jewish. This is not migration. I think there's only one person I know of who settled in Leeds. Is that right?
I think that's right. That was my family.
Yes, this lady's grandfather was the only person I'd come across who actually from Mongolia who settled in Leeds. But a genuine cordial relations for several decades. And you might think this is rather peculiar that a populous Northern English industrial city should have strong connections with one of the largest, least populated countries in the world. But it's true. And it's very much Mongolia and Leeds, not the United Kingdom in general, or the region in the north of England. It's very specifically Leeds. So that's what I want to talk about. So it's difficult to find a greater contrast, I think. I can't think of any city in this country that's established close connections with enormous, very big open spaces in Central Asia. My own interest began in 1987, where I was invited to go to Ulaanbaatar on behalf of Leeds University. I'll come back to that at the end. So that's Mongolia.
Yes.
That's a photo of, they call them gur. Gur, is that the right pronunciation? Gur, rather than yurt. I think yurt was regarded as rather more Russian. Gur is more Mongolian. So that was a gur, not a few miles outside Ulaanbaatar. So the origin of this talk, which I think I've already covered, Mongolia, its map, size, why Leeds? Why not Manchester or Glasgow? University link was the most serious connection was with the University of Leeds. Also commercial link and a civic link with the city. The key figure in all of this really is Owen Lattimore, so I'll talk about him. Stanley Burton of the Burton the Tailors. And the question is whether Leeds and Ulaanbaatar were twinned. So I'll answer that question. Key figures, Judith Nordby, who was the last lecturer in Mongolian studies at Leeds University. She wrote this report not very long ago, 5 decades of friendly relations, and then I'll come back to talk about my own visit. So Mongolia.
Sorry, just trying to get it.
There used to be quite some confusion between Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. It's perfectly simple. Inner Mongolia is a region of China from 1948. Was then, still is. Whereas Mongolia is the People's Republic of Mongolia, it got still referred to as Outer Mongolia for quite a long time. You may know that the standard of geographical size is Wales. Well, it often is. Somewhere it's twice the size of Wales. But Mongolia is 75 times the size of Wales. I had to keep checking that because I couldn't believe it. It seemed implausible, but it seems to be true. And they're roughly the same population, 3 million, 3.5 million, something like that. So Mongolia proper became independent in the 1920s, became a member of the United Nations in 1961. The United Kingdom established diplomatic relations in 1963, long before the United States did. So you can see Ulaanbaatar roughly in the center of Mongolia. To the north, you've got Siberia. So Mongolia is surrounded by vast communist countries, I mean, Soviet Union and China. And you've got Lake Baikal in Siberia, the largest body of fresh water in the world. Lake Baikal. And that is traditional Mongolian script, which was replaced by Cyrillic under Soviet influence from the 1920s till the 1990s, really. There's some debate about whether Mongolia might return to the traditional script after they became more independent. Well, they were independent, but freer from Soviet domination. But they haven't done that. So why Leeds? University links from the early 1960s. Commercial links with the Burton family buying Kashmir from Mongolia. And civic links, discussions over establishing a twinning arrangement. So the first is the university connection. Owen Latimer, 1900 and 1989. Latimer was, Michael, you didn't know Latimer, did you? No. Ian did, I think. A friend of ours knew Latimer in the university. I think a few people did know him. People who are still around remember him in the university. He was born in the United States, spent early childhood in China, where his father was working for the government. And then, having had some education in this country and elsewhere, he returned to China in the 1920s, working as a businessman, a trader. I've got a book, extraordinary book I've found recently. Tents in Mongolia, which is published in 1935. It's a puffin book, and that doesn't look much like a puffin book to me. Pretty advanced young readers, I would say. But this is the true story of a group of Danish explorers who journeyed from China through Mongolia, went into Siberia in the 1920s. This was published in 1935. They must have gone more or less where Latimer went in the 20s and 30s. They don't mention him, but it's an extraordinary story. And then, where have we got to? Rather austere-looking character, So in his work in the 20s and 30s, he became fluent in Chinese, Mongolian, Russian, and French. At a certain point, after he'd returned to the United States, working in Johns Hopkins University, in 1950, he was visiting Kabul. And while in Kabul, he received this message from a friend warning him that Joseph McCarthy targeted him as being a Russian spy. For someone like McCarthy, somebody who was so familiar with the region, who was, traveling around communist countries, highly suspect. So Senator McCarthy says, off the record, you top Russian espionage agent. McCarthy had decided there were 205 communists working in the State Department. Lattimore had never worked in the State Department. This was just an invention, at the time when all sorts of things were being invented. So his book, this is Lattimore's book, Ordeal by Slander, which in fact you can find in this library. Brilliant. Talking about his experience with the McCarthy trials. So he decided he'd better get back home. And he was coming back via London, the first English-speaking country on his journey home. And he was concerned. I was worried. He was worried about how he was going to be received in London. And he says, I need not have worried. The British authorities handled everything with the unruffled calm that only the British appear to be able to summon up when everything is going haywire. So he ended up with a very positive view of this country. It's quite nice to know. He went back to the States. His career was basically ruined because of these accusations, even though he was never convicted of any of these imaginary crimes. And he could never pursue his academic career in the States. In 1961, there was a thing called the Hayter Report, British government report on the study of Asian languages. And Leeds set up a department of Chinese studies. Lattimore became the first head of the department. And he persuaded the university to introduce Mongolian to the curriculum. Now, he had no university degree himself. He was 63 years old. I can't imagine that anybody in the university had much knowledge of Mongolia. But he managed to persuade them. And from that point on, Leeds University became the place to go to for Mongolian studies. And this is what he wrote. It's as if, in a weird way, Baltimore were the sleepy English village where nothing ever happened, and Leeds the driving, creative American city, with people thinking and doing all the time. Again, it's quite nice to read. This is from the 1960s. So he became very familiar with Mongolia from the point of view of Leeds University, and several other members of Leeds University staff traveled to Mongolia, visited Mongolia. And it became this very close, strong relationship, and in both directions. From the early 60s, Mongolian staff, particularly staff from the university, teachers of English, came to Leeds for fairly short periods of time. I did some teaching of Mongolian visitors in the 1980s. where have we got to? Oh, that's the next one. So the director of the international office at Leeds University wrote at some point in about 1991, there had been 100 Mongolian students and staff coming to Leeds. That's a lot in a country of only hardly 3 million. So Leeds, I think you could say, really established a close connection. And I know that people who became, let's say, the Mongolian ambassador in London and other politicians, Leeds was the place they knew about in this country, more than London or any other city. Move on to the second aspect of this relationship, which was the Burton Company, Stanley Burton. They used to come along to receptions that we held for Mongolian visitors. So more or less a contemporary of Latimore's. Son of Montagu, member of the Anglo-Mongolian Society. He went to Mongolia on official visits a couple of times in the 1970s, at a time height of the Cold War. I think it was probably quite an honor to be invited to become an official guest of the Mongolian government. I've been trying to get information about the buying of Kashmir. I've looked in the university archive of the Stanley and Audrey Burton archive in the university. I can't find any mention of Kashmir there, nor in the Burton Company archive in West Yorkshire archive. There must be somewhere.
Perhaps the Bradford Textile Society archive,
Yes.
because Dawson's also bought, Dawson Group also used to buy cashmere from Mongolian, I believe.
I do. Oh, yes. Oh, well, thank you. So there's the Bradford Textile.
Bradford Textile Society.
Maybe the Leeds Textile Archive. Yeah. Michael helped to set up the okay. And Stanley Burton became chairman of the Leeds City Council's the Triple Twinning Committee. Weren't satisfied with just an ordinary twinning. The idea was to have a triple twinning.
Came across him once, only once, and I thought, wow, what a suit. What a suit he was wearing.
He's a tall man, wasn't he, Stanley?
Hey,
He was a tall.
he was taller than Arnold,
Oh,
was his twin, I believe.
uh-huh.
They ended up managing what was the largest clothing factory in the world in South Leeds.
Yeah, it was actually Raymond and Al that were the twins, because they unveiled the blue
And they were
platform.
the twins.
They were
weren't
the twins, yes. So Stanley was slightly older, I think.
Oh, Stanley was older.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, the more I know. No. I'm going to learn a lot. So there's triple twinning committee was going to twin Leeds, Lille, which is still a twin of Leeds, and Ulaanbaatar. That was the idea.
Not Dortmund? Is that connected?
I don't know where. I know Dortmund is still is a twin, isn't it? But this was specifically Leeds, Lille, and Ulaanbaatar. What do we get next? Yeah, so this is written by David Baker, who was director of the university's international office. So City Links began in 1965, so quite early on. Instigated by Stanley Burton chairman of the Committee on International Cooperation. His initiative had the support of Owen Latimer. You could say that Stanley Burton was a bridge between these three aspects of the relationship with Mongolia. He obviously knew Latimer well. So the intention was a triple twinning arrangement. So I searched through minutes of city committees. I can't find any mention of Ulaanbaatar. So something was signed but never formally ratified, and in effect it didn't happen.
I always thought it did.
Do you?
Yeah,
I was told it had.
yeah, well, I mean, I was a councillor from '88. And I wasn't, specifically involved in any way. But in my mind, it is that Leeds did twin with Ulaanbaatar. I thought the Lord Mayor went there once.
Yes, Douglas Gabb. Was it Douglas Gabb? He went. Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know whether you can find a piece of paper, but I thought it was formally done.
Well, I couldn't find it minuted.
In which minutes?
The Leisure Services
It wouldn't be leisure
Committee.
services. No, it wouldn't be leisure services. It'd probably be full council minutes. Yeah, well, I mean, who knows for sure, but I certainly was what I had.
I think there were sort of official civic visits
Yeah,
in both directions, but that's not necessarily,
no, I understand.
doesn't necessarily amount to twinning. Or whatever, what's three-way twinning? Tripling. So Judith Nordby was a key person in this relationship. In teaching Mongolian studies at the university, she was a student of Latimer's and visited Mongolia quite frequently. And she wrote a report which commemorated 50 years of this relationship. It must have been around 2013. And US and Japanese governments sent diplomats to Leeds to learn Mongolian. One thing that happened when I visited in 1987 was there was a mission from the United States to set up an embassy for the first time in Mongolia. And so in the 1980s and 90s, Leeds provided information, consultancy. So it was the place to go to internationally. And as Mongolia kind of opened up after 1990, there's increasing interest, I think, in establishing diplomatic relations with Mongolia. So my visit. So I'll just finish off with a bit of a travelogue, I'm afraid, but it was just so extraordinary. I was sitting at home. I was between contracts. I wasn't in Leeds, but the director of the English language unit phoned me and asked me if I was willing to go to Mongolia. I was 33 years old. I knew nothing about Mongolia. So obviously I said yes. So I went. First of all, that's a view from the plane from Irkutsk to Ulaanbaatar. It was cold. And then the river not flowing through the center of Ulaanbaatar. A view over the city. And a place, I don't know whether you've been to places which are, when you were younger, or when you first went to places and had such an impression. I would never want to go back. I think I would be so disappointed because it won't look anything like this. My memory would be, it would not be as it is now. And a large proportion of the population of Ulaanbaatar lived in these compounds of Gurs. Gurs, I can't pronounce it. Is that right? Gur? A huge proportion lived in these compounds of Gurs. They were like they're felt. And outside the city, they're more used by nomads and can be easily transported on the back of a horse. These are obviously more established. I did read recently that because of economic problems and problems of energy, people have been moving back into the city to live in such compounds because they're warm. Sorry, that is in the centre, or was, it's gone, apparently. It was this sort of copy of Lenin's mausoleum, commemorating Sukhbaatar, the father of the revolution. That has now been demolished, apparently, to expand whatever the building is behind. Fathers of revolutions are no longer particularly popular, such as him. I think that must have been more or less the last statue of Stalin outside Gori, where it is. But he's gone. I'm not sure about this tank. But you can see in various ways, when I went, 1980s, 87, there was still very strong Soviet influence. And that's me. I was 33, it's not my horse. I was 33, I was young. And it was just so exciting. And on the bottom right is the university. There were 2 Buddhist temples that had been allowed to remain. Because most Buddhist temples and Buddhist priests were got rid of in the 1920s. There's a bit of a bibliography there. But I can recommend Latimore's book. My job in going to Ulaanbaatar was to visit the university to assess the teaching of English, particularly for ministries in the government. It was sponsored by UNESCO, which was strange because at that time in 1987, the government of this country had withdrawn membership of UNESCO in 1985. We had a government then that was not very keen on that kind of thing, if you remember. So that's why I went. I was asked to go there, report on the teaching of English. Most of the teaching of English was done by older Mongolian teachers who had been trained in the Soviet Union in what we would call grammar translation methods, which means you learn the grammar and you practice translation, and that's it. Which did not particularly suit people who wanted to learn the foreign language in order to communicate and do aspects of their job. There was one superb example of more modern methods, what we call ESP, English for Specific Purposes. There was a British Council lecturer, and his job was just to do communication, spoken English, with these various people. And the University Department of English had a contract with MIAT, which was the Mongolian airline. Hitherto, the airline had only really travelled to places in the Soviet Union where the language of air traffic control was Russian. They were then going to start up flights to Beijing, and the language would be English. So Martin from the British Council's job was to try and train these people. And the airline sent pilots and stewardesses to the university. The pilots took this very, very seriously. They came in uniform. Martin, who had almost no materials to work with, he persuaded somebody in the university to provide for him a large sheet of polystyrene. And he marked out runways, taxiways. He found a little plastic building for the terminal. And he found a little child's airplane with a little piloting. Brilliant, superb. And so he would give these Mongolian pilots instructions, taxi to whatever it was, runway, something or other. And these men in their uniforms would kind of move along. It was superb, brilliant, and effective. And he wrote a sort of text, sort of script for the air stewardesses to read out and learn, presumably. And he had flashcards for hazards like cow on runway. But it was really good. I mean, it's the best example of ESP. And I used to use this in my teacher training as a brilliant example of what can be done with nothing. So because of the time I went, partly because it's very cold, but there was no freedom of travel. I couldn't go anywhere other than I could walk around the city on my own. At least I think I was probably on my own, but I'm not sure. So it was an extraordinary experience. I think that's it, basically. There's no real conclusion to this. There's a certain irony, I think, in that when Mongolia opened up to the rest of the world much more freely, there was no longer a need for this kind of special relationship with somewhere like Leeds. I think Ulaanbaatar was twinned with about 24 cities around the world, but nowhere in this country, not Leeds. So that sort of died out, although there are still cordial relations, friendly visits. The ambassador comes along and is welcomed.
I met the ambassador once. I once had a student from Mongolia, one student from Mongolia, and I ended up speaking to the ambassador over the phone. I thought he's the ambassador of the country. I spoke to him over the phone.
Yes, yes. I think
he came and he visited me. I thought he's the ambassador.
Little old you.
The whole country.
Yeah, well, they were like that. I think they were really pleased because I think they genuinely felt a connection with Leeds, which lasted beyond their sort of greater diplomatic freedom. I did write here somewhere, how many university libraries in this country have a Mongolian section? There are two. Oh, I know, Leeds and Cambridge. You mentioned Caroline Humphreys.
She was my grandfather's research support when he was in the student at Town College in Cambridge. Mostly he was in Leeds.
And Caroline was a student of Latimore's.
Student of others.
Of both of them? Or?
I think predominantly of them.
Yeah.
So it's but we settled in Leeds.
And somewhere I wrote down, I think it was somebody who became prime minister or even president who came to visit Leeds.
They were quite prone to turning up at my grandparents. So Owen Maxwell was my grandfather's mentor. My grandfather was his research assistant when they were at John Hopkins. And he later on became Professor of Foreign Languages at Leeds University. So he, after Maxwell retired. So I have photos of me on Professor Maxwell's knee as a youngster in the 80s. He was a regular at family occasions, and we called him Lavak, but he was the great teacher. So, but it was my grandmother particularly would be, if people came, Mongol ambassador occasionally, but mostly Mongol students would come and they would get home cooking. So when I was growing up, my grandmother looked after me while my mum was at work, and there would be a regular stream of Mongol students coming in and eating home cooked food.
Thank you, that's really interesting. But I think I can say again, not many people know about it. People in the university don't, do they, Michael?
No.
Very few.
Well, I didn't know anyone knew about it until you began to speak about it.
Yeah.
Is there still Mongolian studies at Leeds University? Is
I
it
don't think so.
Chinese?
I don't think so.
Mm.
There's the School of East Asian Studies, where you have Chinese, various other Japanese and so on, but no Mongolian now. Well, it's supply and demand, I'm afraid. It's a shame.
Are there any other, or were there any other cities or institutions in Western Europe, as one might say at the time, that had connections with Mongolia, or was Leeds it?
I don't know of any others. I don't know. Do you?
But I don't know. So when they all came, there were four who came over to work for Matamor. And some of them stayed in America, and some of them went back home. But there was one group that went to Germany because completely randomly, one of their grandchildren now works as a translator for Cirque du Soleil. And his Facebook is weird. We ended up both liking a photo of a traditional food, and she found him. But also free tickets to Cirque du Soleil. But yeah, and I think it was great uncle rather than grandfather who said he's in Germany, but I don't know whether that led to any further relationship.
No.
It's funny, we also had at the same time as the Mongolians came to the English language unit, we also had groups of teachers of English from the Soviet Union over several years, 80s particularly. And the contrast was extraordinary. The Mongolians, I always thought, as soon as they arrived, they behaved as if they'd always lived here. They were amazingly relaxed. Maybe that's what got them to the gates of Vienna in the 13th century. Whereas the Soviet Union, I think partly because the Soviet groups always had a minder, a political minder. They were much more nervous and critical, and they didn't really want to kind of relax. And we also had Chinese students as well. I took a coach tour to Stratford. The Soviet teachers, the Mongolians, and the Chinese. And it struck me at the time, here I am, driving through rural Warwickshire, most conservative part of the country, with a coach full of communists.
So when did it pull out of the Soviet Union then?
It never was. It was never in the Soviet Union. No. No. It was a kind of satellite, heavily influenced and under the control of the Soviet Union. When I went in '87, the professor of the head of department, because he knew what I was trying to find out. I wanted to find out about the interest in English language in the West in the university, and I couldn't find out anything. He drew me to one side into the corridor. I think because the room where they worked was booked. And he said, I know what you're trying to find out. but I can't tell you. It was very controlled. So, but never actually part of the Soviet Union.
Did you have anything with Tibet? Because I can recall, but I think it was after the Chinese had taken over, there was a PhD thesis at the university from the School of Music, and it was to do with Tibetan cinema music. And I was handling copyright at the time in the legal affairs department, were supposedly the most taxing problems. And the issue came up that the Chinese were now going to claim copyright when in the past anything you worked for was for the good of the people, so you could not have a personal copyright. And I think it was probably the most taxing issue I ever dealt with, but a lovely female research candidate. And I finally said, well, and the Tibetan music being a very specialist form, which had been adapted for the cinema and propaganda purposes. And I finally said, if you do know who any of the composers are, can you get in touch with them? Rather than go through the official channels, let's put it like that. And she found this chap who asked around, and the answer came back, as long as you don't say who we were, because we hated having to do it. And they did not want to be associated with the copyright of this. I think it was a local music, especially special sounds. But I actually did encounter Owen Lampton in my early days, so I'm very pleased that this talk was said.
Oh, good, good. Thank you. Yes, I wish I'd met him. I didn't.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any?
Just
Yeah,
going
please.
back to Stanley Burton, I think he was a member of a body called the Cloth Workers Advisory Board, the Department of Textile Industries. The Cloth Workers Company, of course.
That Michael's from that.
Yes, I've been in the past, I'm from the work.
Well, I served on it for a few years in the late 80s, 90s, and I think Stanley Burton was a member of it, of that advisory committee. And so if there are any records from that, which presumably would be part of the wherever the archive of the Department of Textile Industries is, there might be more there. But I'm sure if you're looking at stuff about cashmere buying, a company called Dawson International, who are based in Bradford, were very heavily involved in that, and that's why I suggested the Bradford Textile Society.
Okay, thank you.
Bradford Textile Society, I don't know whether they have them.
Well, I'm sure they must at least have back copies of their journals, which they published every year. So there might be an article in there.
They may well have. Well,
Can I just ask a question about terminology? Mainly about you mentioned that some of the students described them as Mongols. Is that a correct term to use?
I honestly don't know. I think it's very difficult. It has difficult connotations. I think if I was going to be grammatically correct, we would refer to ourselves as Mongols, but we tend to prefer Mongolian to avoid the sort of confusion that actually happened when my family first moved here. There was a degree of confusion as to what was moving in.
Well, the reason I asked was because you actually mentioned the term, which I haven't heard in decades. Interesting.
Can you ask it? Do you know how or why your grandfather came? And you know, anything about his family in Mongolia? And was he from Ulaanbaatar as well?
He was not from Ulaanbaatar, he was from Hokhot, which is technically in Mongolia.
Yeah.
But it's sort of on that boundary.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of long and complicated story involving him working with Latimore with the American government. And my grandmother was also a politician, so they were based in for a long time in Nanjing. But obviously then the Chinese Civil War put paid to everything they were doing. He left and went to he left with Professor Latimore, and they stayed in he was in America when Nanjing fell, and my grandmother got out with my mother sort of in quite a rush.
Yeah.
But they had not intended, they thought it was going to be temporary.
Yeah.
And effectively the Iron Curtain fell behind me. She had no idea when she left she'd never see some of her family again. My grandfather did, because he went on one of the trips, he went on a couple of the trips from Leeds University to Mongolia. He went on, so he did make contact, but that's how he ended up working with Latimore. And then when my doctor came here, he asked my grandfather to come just for a 5-year assignment. But my grandmother grew roses above the door in her little house in Abel that she's still living in until she died a few years ago, and refused to leave. She loved Leeds and she just simply refused to leave. So they stayed here. It's the longest she'd ever lived anywhere, is in Leeds.
Yeah. I mean, were there any other commercial things, Peter? I mean, often the twinning of cities, towns with other countries leads to business
I don't know.
relationships. I mean, you mentioned Kashmir.
Yes, well, that's the only connection, commercial connection that I know.
Yeah.
But there could well be others. I don't know.
Yeah. I wonder what industry they had over there. Probably some coal. Coal. Yeah.
Sulphurous coal.
Mining. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, possibly too cold over there and barren for much agriculture.
Well, this is an interesting thing, because these Danes were going to Mongolia to develop agriculture. Loads of sheep.
Yeah. Well, hence the
Cows,
the
camels.
Yeah. 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 Right. Was it anything online, Alan? Any comments?
The Zoom.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Okay. No further questions or observations in the room. Great. Well, thank you, Peter, for that enlightening talk.